Hi, and thanks for joining us again today, and welcome back to Cybersecurity Elevated, brought to you by c1risk.com. My name's Stuart Canning. I am occasionally the voice and occasionally the face of C1 Risk, and I'll be your host for today. Today, we're going to be looking at internal controls as part of our ongoing Control Freaks series, where we're sharing knowledge on hopefully everything you need to know to understand control, the frameworks, control requirements, controls that you need to implement, and then how to efficiently and quickly implement them to help build out and scale your compliance program as part of your GRC and information security practices. So we'll be focusing on first, what is an internal control? Then we'll touch on what we call design effectiveness, how you actually establish and write those controls to make sure that they are A, going to protect your organization effectively, and B, of course, pass that all important audit when that audit period comes around. And then finally, we'll be touching on assurance or how we actually validate those controls and make sure that they're being implemented effectively. Okay, so let's get started. And first, we're going to address then, what is an internal control? Okay, so today we engaged, sticking with that humanities or scholarly theme, we actually engaged the help of our local, globally renowned research university, University of California, San Francisco, UCSF. And here is their definition of an internal control. So an internal control is a process affected by an entity's board of directors, management, and other personnel designed to provide reasonable assurance and see that the information is reliable, accurate, and timely, of compliance with applicable laws, of the reliability of financial reporting. So it's a combination of all of these things. So from an information security perspective, it may not just depend on financial report, or it may not just point to financial reporting. It could be any kind of reporting related to security. But this really gives you kind of a good idea of what you're heading towards when you're putting those internal controls in place. This is a really good meta definition of what we should be aiming for in terms of internal controls. So thank you, UCSF. So now let's go into the platform and let's get a little more granular and go into an example of how we would actually establish and write an internal control. Okay, so here we are in the C1 Risk platform, and you see that we have our obligations library here. Just a quick plug, or last one. With the C1 Risk platform, you get access to this obligations library. We've got more than 100 global regulations and standards available to you. They're all crosswalk, so you can see where they relate. And if you haven't been following our Control Freaks series, this would be a good time for you to go back and look on YouTube or on our blog. And you can see our blog on obligations and what obligations, regulations, and standards are, and how we use them in the C1 Risk platform and apply them for compliance. So today we're going to be working in ISO 27001, one of the most common, really the international standard, literally, for information security. And we're going to show you how to build out your internal control. So I'm going to go into our control library, and actually we're going to be working with a specific control, 18.2.2, which is the compliance with security policies and standards. So note, when you come into our GRC library, what you get is what ISO is asking for. So this is the control requirement, not the internal control. This is what ISO wants you to do. So the internal control then, of course, is how you're going to implement what ISO wants you to do. But we also have a sample guidance here to help you along, where this will help you write the control and understand what you actually need to do to implement the control and validate it. And we collect this guidance from our audit partners. We work with many different auditors with C1 Risk, and they've helped us compile this to really help you accelerate your compliance work and get to readiness as quickly as possible, so you can get into audit, start protecting your organization, and maintain those certifications. So we see the control requirement here. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to actually write my internal control. Note that they're all linked automatically in the C1 Risk platform. So I'm just going to do add new. And then first thing I want to do is, of course, give this a name. I might want to reference this to ISO. So I might put 18.2.2, and then just maybe something like compliance with security standards, or maybe how the company complies with security standards. Now let's talk about design effectiveness a little bit. So we're going to go into the description of the control. And this is where that design effectiveness piece comes in, and where it's really, really important that you incorporate certain elements. This is what the auditor is going to want to see when you write that control. Broadly speaking, there are three things that you need to include. That is, who is implementing the control? How is it being implemented? And how often? So in our internal control record in the C1 risk platform, note that we can actually add the frequency here. So we can track how often this control is going to be implemented and set the cadence here. And we can also associate a primary contact. So this is actually a control owner, so the person who is implementing this control. That said, we still want to make sure that we're very, very clear in our description as to how we're writing that internal control. So we really want to be very, very clear to incorporate all of these elements. So the final thing to note then here is, of course, company compliance with security standards, as that guidance showed us, can mean a number of different things. So there are a couple of different ways to approach this. Typically speaking, that would require multiple internal controls to show everything that you do and validate. Sometimes, depending on the type of requirement that you're working with, so ISO, for example, is a little more, is a little bit broader in what it will allow. You can write a single control like this that provides all of the different aspects of what you do to ensure these compliance and security standards. But today we're just going to write a single control. So one of the things that we looked at as that we were given as guidance was security awareness training. So we're going to put in a control for security awareness training. So again, following this process, the information security, or maybe it's the HR team, provides and tracks completion of security awareness training annually for all managers. So who is implementing the control? So InfoSec, or maybe it's HR. How is it being implemented? We're ensuring compliance by providing security awareness training. And how often are we doing it? We're doing it annually. Okay. So again, this is just a very basic example of how you can write it. But again, make sure you incorporate those three specific elements, and the more precise you can be, the better the design of your control, the more likely it is going to be to pass audit. So let's now just touch on assurance and validation. So once you've got that control in place, one of the things that the auditor is going to look at is the implementation of your control. We call that control strength over here. So what you really want to be able to do is, or make sure that you're doing, is write a control that you know that you either are or can implement. And this is really shown by your control strength here. So sometimes you might have a control that you know that you've got to put in, but you haven't had the chance to implement it yet, and therefore, of course, you can't validate that it's being implemented. Doesn't mean you shouldn't write the control. You can put that control in and then just label it with this control strength here as being, not implemented effectively, so very barely implemented. That way you can track this and go back to this and make sure that you are building out the implementation protocols to implement this as soon as possible. Partially implemented probably goes around 50%. And that way, that would be typically a control that you actually are doing, but perhaps you haven't put it in a policy yet, or you're not doing it fully. There's a couple of aspects of it that are still missing. Again, these controls are valuable to have, but you got to know what's missing and what's going to actually get you to that completion. Anything above 80%, if you put anything above 80%, you really have to make sure that you can validate it. A control that is 100% implemented is actually pretty rare, because there are always risks that can happen. There are things that can go wrong. So typically, if you're noting fully implemented, you might say 80%, you might say 90%, depending on how bold you are. But 80% and above means that it's fully implemented. And if you put that 80%, then what you need to be able to do is to provide that evidence that it is being implemented. Now, the auditor will help you define that in many cases, but that evidence is really going to be the key to your assurance and actually being able to validate this control. And then part of that is understanding how frequently you have to implement this control to make sure it's properly validated and collect that evidence. So again, this would be an annual control, as we've set it out as an annual process for security awareness training. So once you bear that in mind, then what you need to do is develop your evidence and say, okay, we're going to collect we're going to send out security awareness training, and we're going to collect those validations, make sure everybody sends in their attestation whenever they've completed the security awareness training. All of that will need to be provided as evidence to validate this control. Okay, so that's the basics of how to write an internal control, what design effectiveness is, this who, how, and how often, and the assurance, that evidence that you need to actually make sure that that control is correct and validated and get through that audit. And of course, again, protect your organization. If you have any questions, put them in the comments below or reach out to us at c1risk.com. Thanks again. This has been another episode of Cybersecurity Elevated, brought to you by C1 Risk.